I've never been one to believe in ghost stories or things I can't explain, but what happened to me a few years ago still keeps me up at night. It was a regular Tuesday, nothing special, and I was using my day off to organize the house. It wasn't until the early evening that I realized my cat, Daisy, was nowhere to be found. Daisy was always an explorer, and though she was skittish, she loved sneaking out into the backyard. After calling her everywhere and getting no response, I grabbed a flashlight and went out to look for her. There was a cemetery near my house, and while it seemed like an unlikely place, I decided to check it out. The place had a heavy atmosphere, but it was quiet at night, and I just wanted to make sure she hadn't wandered in there. I got to the cemetery a little after 8 p.m. The sky was clear, and the full moon bathed the place in a cold, silvery glow. The silence was so intense that the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel echoed around me. I called out for Daisy several times as I walked between the gravestones, shining the flashlight on the ground. That's when I heard it, a sound that made my heart skip a beat. It was a soft, muffled sob, like a child crying. My first thought was that it could have been a noise coming from the houses nearby, but it was too clear, coming from inside the cemetery. I followed the sound, feeling a chill crawl up my spine, and then I saw him. There he was, sitting beside an old gravestone, his arms wrapped around his knees and his face buried between them. It was a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with messy dark hair and clothes that looked like they came from a thrift store. He was quietly sobbing, and my first instinct was to help. I approached him slowly, trying not to startle him. "Hey, are you okay? What are you doing here alone?" I asked in a gentle voice. He lifted his face slowly, and what I saw made me uneasy. His eyes were red from crying, but it wasn't just that. It was the expression on his face, a mix of sadness and something I couldn't quite place. He just shook his head like he didn't know or didn't want to answer. "Are you lost? Where are your parents?" I tried again, but he only pointed to the gravestone beside him. It was an old, weathered stone covered in patches of moss. I froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to get the boy out of there, to find help, but another part of me felt that something was profoundly wrong. Then, something made me look around. There was no one else nearby, no sign of movement besides the two of us. That eerie feeling of being watched crept over me, but the boy remained still, as if time itself had stopped. As I was trying to figure out what to do, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. It was a reminder that it was already past 9 p.m. I hesitated for a second before pulling out the phone and turning on the flashlight to better illuminate the gravestone next to the boy. The name etched on it was almost illegible, but the date caught my eye. The gravestone was over 50 years old. That didn't make any sense. "Do you live around here?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't respond, just stared at me with those empty eyes that seemed to carry a weight far heavier than any child should bear. My stomach churned. Something about this situation felt wrong on a level I couldn't explain. I decided the best thing to do was to leave and get help. "Come on, I'll take you to the police station. They can help find your parents." I held out my hand, but he didn't move. He just stood there, looking at me, like he was trapped in some sort of trance. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. "You can't stay here alone," I insisted. After a few seconds, he finally stood up, but he didn't take my hand. He started walking ahead of me, his steps slow and dragging. The sound of his boots on the gravel echoed more than it should have. A chill ran down my spine. With every step, the feeling that we were being watched grew stronger. We reached the cemetery gate, but before leaving, I turned to look at the boy again. He was standing still, staring into the darkness, as if he could see something I couldn't. "What is it?" I asked, trying to see what had caught his attention. He didn't answer, but his face looked paler, his eyes deeper. Something was very wrong. I decided to quicken my pace and left the cemetery, hoping he would follow, but when I turned back, he was gone. Panic hit me like a wave. I looked around calling for him, but there was no trace of anyone. I spent the next several minutes running between gravestones, shouting for the boy, but he had vanished as if he'd never been there. My heart felt like it was about to burst. I decided to call the police, even though I had no idea how to explain what had happened. When they arrived, I told them everything, including the boy's description. They asked a few questions, but in the end, they said there were no reports of a missing child in the area. It wasn't until one of the officers mentioned that this part of the cemetery was known for strange stories that I felt true fear. He gave me a curious but non-judgmental look and asked if I wanted to make an official statement. I decided to give a statement, even though the situation felt surreal. As I described the boy in as much detail as I could, I noticed the officer taking my report seemed increasingly uncomfortable. When I finished, she closed her notebook and spoke in a low voice. "You're not the first person to talk about a boy like that around here." My heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to hide my unease. She hesitated before continuing. "Some people say they've seen a boy fitting that description, always near the same gravestone, but we've never been able to confirm anything. It might just be a coincidence." Her voice trembled more than her words suggested, and that only made me feel more unsettled. I went home that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything that had happened in my mind, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a lost child who found another way home? But how did he disappear so quickly? And why did no one in the town seem to know anything? The next day, I spent hours researching online, trying to find any mention of a missing boy or similar stories in the area. That's when I stumbled upon a thread in a local forum about the cemetery. The stories there sounded like a collection of horror tales, but one post caught my attention. Someone described seeing a boy exactly like the one I encountered, in the same spot. The post was from 5 years ago and described an encounter eerily similar to mine. A boy crying beside a gravestone who vanished without a trace. At that moment, it felt like a crushing weight had been placed on my chest. It couldn't just be a coincidence. I decided to return to the cemetery later that afternoon, while there was still daylight, to see if I could find any clues. This time, I took Daisy with me since she had reappeared in the yard that morning as if nothing had happened. The cemetery seemed less threatening in the daylight, but even so, the silence was oppressive. When I reached the gravestone, a shiver ran down my spine. The gravestone looked more weathered than it had the night before, as if decades had passed in a matter of hours. I touched the stone, trying to read the name again, but I could only make out a few letters. That's when I heard a noise behind me. I turned quickly, but there was nothing except Daisy, her fur bristling as she stared at something I couldn't see. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but something made me stay for a few more minutes. That's when I noticed an object on the ground, right next to the gravestone. It was a small toy car, old and rusted. When I picked it up, I felt like someone was watching me closely, even though I was completely alone. I picked up the toy car carefully, trying to ignore the growing unease in my chest. It looked old, like it had been there for decades, but at the same time it was clean, as if someone had just placed it there. I decided to take the toy with me, thinking it might be a clue, something to help me understand what was going on. As soon as I got home, I put the car on the living room table and went straight to my computer. I spent hours reading about the cemetery and the strange stories linked to it, but nothing seemed to lead to a clear answer. It was like each account was a piece of a puzzle no one could solve. That night, something changed. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a low sound, a faint hissing coming from the living room. My heart raced as I got up, thinking it might be the TV or some device left on, but when I entered the room, the floor felt unnaturally cold beneath my feet, as if the temperature had dropped significantly. The TV was off, and the hissing was coming from the toy car. It was still in the same spot where I had left it, but now it was emitting a soft sound, like tiny wheels spinning. I froze for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing, until the car moved. Just slightly, but enough to make me drop everything and run back to my bedroom. I spent the rest of the night locked in my room, listening for any sounds from the living room. When the sun finally came up, I gathered the courage to go check. The car was exactly where I had left it, but the hissing sound was gone. That's when I decided to get rid of it. I grabbed the toy, put it in a bag, and drove to a landfill in the neighboring town. I threw the car away and came back home, trying to convince myself that this would solve the problem. For a few weeks, nothing happened, and I started to believe it had all been a mix of coincidences and my imagination. But then, one night, as I was closing the windows before going to bed, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, outside my house, standing near the gate, was a boy. The same boy. He wasn't crying this time. He was just standing there, staring at me. And then, without any warning, he turned around and walked into the darkness, disappearing into the night. I haven't seen him since, but sometimes, when the silence at night becomes too heavy, I think I can hear a faint hissing sound, like the wheels of a toy car spinning on the floor. I've never been the superstitious type, but I'm not completely skeptical either. I've always tried to look at strange things with a bit of logic, you know. That was until that night, about 3 years ago, when I was walking home after staying late at work. I lived in a small town back then, one of those places where everything closes by 8 p.m. and the silence becomes almost deafening. The only shortcut to my house went through an old cemetery, with graves that looked like they belonged in a horror movie. But since I took that route all the time, it was practically routine. Nothing ever happened, until that night. It was close to midnight, and the air felt heavier than usual. Something about the night felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The streets were empty, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel under my sneakers as I walked. I pushed open the rusty cemetery gate, which creaked loud enough to make me glance back, just to be sure. Everything seemed normal, or as normal as a cemetery could be at that hour. The tall, gnarled trees cast eerie shadows, but nothing that made me quicken my pace. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but there was definitely someone there. They were far back, maybe 20 feet away, walking at the same pace as me. It was hard to make out any details in the dark, but it looked like someone in a long coat. I figured it was just another shortcut taker, like me. That's not uncommon, you know? People who live nearby often cut through the cemetery to save time. Still, something about it didn't sit right. I kept walking, trying to ignore the uneasiness, but every step I took seemed perfectly mirrored by the steps behind me. I stole a glance over my shoulder, and the figure was still there, keeping the same distance. They didn't make any sound besides their footsteps, which was odd because gravel usually echoes loudly. My stomach began to knot, but I told myself it was just paranoia. After all, if they wanted to do something, they would have done it already, right? I tried to focus on the path ahead, but the feeling of being watched consumed me. Each time the sound of those footsteps reached my ears, it felt closer. I knew it was better not to show fear, so I kept walking at the same pace, not looking back. Then I noticed something that made my breath catch. The footsteps started to speed up. It wasn't gradual, you know. It was a sudden shift from walking to running. The sound of gravel being crushed grew louder, closing the distance fast, like whoever it was had decided it was time to act. My heart raced, and before I could even think, my body took over. I dove behind one of the larger tombstones, its worn inscription barely legible. I crouched there, trying to steady my breathing, which felt way too loud for the silence around me. The sound of the footsteps stopped abruptly, but I couldn't tell where they were anymore. It was like the air around me had frozen. All I could hear was the blood pounding in my ears. I forced myself not to peek over the tombstone, afraid of what I might see. After a few seconds, or maybe it was minutes, I honestly don't know, I heard something that made my spine tingle. a dry sound, like nails scraping against stone. It didn't come from where the footsteps had been, but closer, maybe even from the tombstone I was hiding behind. I held my breath, trying to make sense of it. The feeling that something was profoundly wrong grew stronger. It wasn't just the fact that I was being followed. There was something deeply unnatural about that presence. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. I mustered the courage to sneak a quick glance over the tombstone, and what I saw left me paralyzed. The figure was standing in the middle of the path, staring directly at the tomb where I was hiding. I couldn't make out a face, just a grotesque shadow stretched in impossible ways. Before I could react, it started running toward me again, but this time the sound of its steps was erratic, as if it wasn't just one person running. Instinct took over, and I bolted, weaving between the tombstones, not caring about the noise I was making. All I wanted was to get out of there as fast as I could. I ran aimlessly, dodging tombstones, but it felt like the cemetery had turned into an endless maze. No matter which direction I went, the graves seemed to grow denser, as if they were trying to trap me there. And the erratic footsteps behind me didn't stop. They were getting closer. My chest burned, and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but stopping wasn't an option. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I could see the figure getting nearer, distorted by the darkness, its shadow moving as if it had a mind of its own. I spotted an old mausoleum, with its door slightly ajar, and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me with all the strength I had left. The sound echoed, and the silence that followed was even more oppressive. My whole body was trembling so much that it was hard to keep my breath quiet. Inside, the air was freezing, and the smell of mildew was overwhelming, like no one had stepped foot there in decades. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to hear if that thing was still outside. Nothing. Not a single sound. I should have felt relieved, but I couldn't. Something was very wrong inside that mausoleum. Around me, the walls were covered in inscriptions I couldn't understand. Symbols that seemed to shift and move whenever I tried to focus on them. The only sound inside was my ragged breathing. But then I noticed something else. Another breath. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it definitely wasn't mine. I froze, unable to move, as the sensation of another presence crept up behind me, like a cold wave crawling up my spine. Slowly, I turned my head to look behind me. In the darkest corner of the mausoleum, I saw something that looked like a shadow, even darker than the surrounding darkness. It seemed to pulse, almost like it had a rhythm of its own, and then it moved, just a subtle shift, but impossible to ignore. My eyes struggled to make sense of what I was seeing, but it was as if the thing defied all logic. Before I could scream or run, I heard the mausoleum door creak open behind me, the sound stretching out like a wail. I was trapped, caught between two things I couldn't explain. Panic took over me. My body froze, as if something invisible was holding every muscle in place, forcing me to face that pulsating shadow. When the door finally finished creaking open, the sound echoed like a scream, and I felt an icy wind sweep through the mausoleum. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was step backwards slowly, pressing myself against the cold wall, trying to distance myself from that living shadow. And then I heard footsteps. They weren't erratic like before, but steady, deliberate, as if someone had entered and was carefully examining every corner. I finally gathered enough courage to turn toward the door. There stood the figure that had been chasing me. But now it wasn't just a distant shadow. It looked like a man, or something that resembled a man, but every detail was wrong. His face was hidden under what seemed to be an old, tattered hood, almost disintegrating, but the most terrifying part was his eyes, or rather, the absence of them. They were just hollow, dark pits, as if nothing existed behind them. He didn't say a word, just stood there, watching me like he was waiting for something. Then, he stepped inside, and the temperature plummeted even further. Behind me, the shadow in the corner began to move, as if it was responding to his presence. That was what broke me out of my paralysis. I let out a hoarse, desperate scream and ran toward the exit, brushing past him so quickly I couldn't tell if he tried to stop me. All I knew was that I had to get out of there. As I crossed the doorway, the air outside felt just as heavy as it did inside. I glanced back, expecting to see him, but the mausoleum door had closed on its own. I didn't stop running until I reached home, but even there, things didn't feel normal again. For weeks, I couldn't sleep properly, plagued by dreams of that shadow and the man without eyes. I didn't tell anyone because who would believe me? All I know is that I never went near that cemetery again, not even during the day. To this day, whenever I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of those erratic footsteps, like a reminder that some things simply defy explanation. Maybe I just picked the wrong shortcut that night, but I'm certain something picked me. I was never very close to my great-aunt Louise, but the news of her death hit me harder than I expected. It was strange to think that someone so full of stories and memories could just disappear without warning. The funeral took place on a humid September afternoon, with that heavy atmosphere only cemeteries seem to have. I was there with my mom, my dad, and my older brother Chris, along with the rest of the family we rarely saw. As the priest said his prayers, the muffled sound of footsteps crunching on dry leaves caught my attention. I discreetly turned my head and saw someone I didn't recognize standing at the back. It was a woman, average height, wearing a long black dress and a veil that partially covered her face. She didn't seem to belong with the rest of the family, who were exchanging glances and quiet sighs. No one else seemed to notice her presence, but something about her stillness and the way she held a small white flower caught my eye. "Who's that?" I whispered to my mom, but she just shook her head, looking puzzled. Chris, ever curious, glanced quickly and whispered back, "Maybe an old friend of Aunt Louise. You know how old folks are." I decided to ignore it, but something about that moment left me uneasy. After the burial, while everyone gathered for coffee at my grandmother's house, I couldn't get that woman out of my head. The feeling of discomfort grew when Chris pulled me aside in the hallway. "Did you see that woman again?" he asked. I shook my head, confused. He continued, "I passed by the cemetery on the way back and I saw her. But she wasn't at Aunt Louise's grave. She was walking between the tombstones, stopping at each one like she was leaving flowers." My stomach churned. It didn't make sense for someone to do that, especially in the middle of the day. But Chris swore it was her. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was stuck on the image of the woman in black wandering alone between the graves. It was as if every detail had etched itself into my memory. The way her veil lightly draped over her face, the silence in her movements. Against my better judgment, I opened my browser and searched for stories about strange people in cemeteries. Most of the results were urban legends or obvious hoaxes, but one account caught my attention. It was from a nearby town and described someone who visited cemeteries at night, leaving flowers on random graves. The description felt all too familiar. It couldn't be real. The next day, Chris was even more intrigued by what he'd seen and insisted we go back to the cemetery before it got dark. Reluctantly, I agreed. My mom thought it was odd, but we told her we just wanted to bring more flowers to Aunt Louise's grave. When we got there, the place was nearly empty, except for 1 or 2 workers cleaning some headstones. We stood near the entrance for a moment, just observing. "She's probably not going to show up," I whispered to Chris, trying to lighten the heavy mood hanging over us. But he seemed convinced she was still around. As we walked through the rows of graves, the silence was almost absolute, broken only by the distant sound of wind rustling through the trees. We finally reached Aunt Louise's grave, but what we found sent chills down my spine. Someone had left a white flower perfectly placed on her headstone. It wasn't just any flower. It was exactly like the one the woman had been holding at the funeral. Chris's eyes widened, but before either of us could say anything, something caught our attention. On the other side of the cemetery, near an old weathered headstone, a figure dressed in black stood motionless. "It's her," Chris whispered, grabbing my arm. For a moment, I thought about running, but curiosity won out. We crouched behind a headstone and watched in silence. The woman knelt slowly and placed another white flower on the grave. Even from a distance, there was something strange about her movements. It didn't feel like an act of mourning or affection, but something almost mechanical, like it was a task she had to complete. We stayed there for a few more minutes, watching as she repeated the same motion at another grave and then another. It felt like watching a ritual. We decided to follow her, keeping a safe distance. The farther we went, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if something unseen was pressing down on us. Then suddenly, she stopped and turned her head in our direction. I don't know how, but I was sure she knew we were there. My heart raced, and Chris grabbed my arm tightly. "We need to get out of here," he muttered, but neither of us could move. She just stood there, staring at us for what felt like an eternity. The veil obscured her face, but I could swear there was the hint of a smile beneath the fabric that chilled me to the bone. When we finally managed to move, we bolted toward the cemetery gate without looking back. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear Chris's footsteps beside me. When we reached the gate, we stopped to catch our breath. "Did you see that?" Chris asked, but I couldn't answer. All I wanted was to get as far away from that place as possible. We walked home in silence, and I couldn't get that image out of my head. The way she looked at us, as if waiting for us to come closer. It was too terrifying to be a coincidence. That night, Chris insisted we needed to tell someone, maybe even alert the authorities, but I didn't even know how to explain what we had seen. "We'll sound crazy," I told him. He didn't agree, but he dropped the subject. For a while, I thought everything was over, but I was wrong. A few days later, while I was in my room, I heard a noise outside. It was late, and my window overlooked a small park across the street. Curious, I peeked through the curtains and felt a chill run down my spine. There she was, the woman in black, standing under a streetlight, holding a white flower. I jumped back from the window and stood there, trying to process what was happening. How could she be there? It didn't make sense. I immediately called Chris, and he picked up on the third ring. "She's here," I whispered, trying to stay calm. He went quiet for a moment before saying, "Don't go outside. I'm on my way." I waited what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. When Chris arrived, we both looked out the window, but she was gone. All that was left was the flower, placed on the bench where she had been standing. We decided we couldn't ignore this anymore. The next day, we went back to the cemetery and spoke to the groundskeeper, an older man named Bill, who seemed to know everything about the place. When we described the woman, he looked visibly uncomfortable. "I've heard about her," he said, staring at the ground. "They say she's been showing up here for years, always at night, leaving flowers. Nobody knows who she is or what she wants, but you're better off staying away from her." His words didn't bring any comfort. If anything, they made everything feel even stranger. Despite Bill's warning, our curiosity wouldn't let us rest. Chris suggested we go back to the cemetery at night, but this time we brought flashlights and what we thought was a bit more courage, though it turned out we were wrong. When we arrived, the place was quieter than ever, as if even the insects had decided to stay away. We walked through the rows of graves, keeping our eyes and ears open for anything unusual. The plan was simple: observe from a distance and try to figure out what this woman was doing. But after almost half an hour of searching, we started to think she wouldn't show up that night. Then, right in the middle of the cemetery, we saw something move in the shadows. There she was, just as before, the black dress, the veil, and the white flower. We stayed hidden behind a gravestone, watching as she walked with slow, deliberate steps, almost gliding from one tombstone to the next. Every time she stopped, she placed the flower with an almost ritualistic precision. It was both hypnotic and terrifying. Chris whispered something to me, but I was so focused I didn't catch it. Everything felt surreal, as if we were stuck in a nightmare. Suddenly she stopped. Not at just any grave, but at Aunt Louise's. My entire body froze as I realized she was now staring directly at where we were hiding. "She knows we're here," I murmured, my voice barely audible. Chris motioned for us to stay quiet, but before we could react, she started walking toward us. Her steps were slow but purposeful, as if she had all the time in the world. Chris's flashlight trembled in his hand, and I felt a growing panic take over me. It was as if the air around us was getting heavier, harder to breathe. When she got within a few feet, the flashlight's beam illuminated her face beneath the veil. It wasn't a human face. I don't know how to describe it. It looked like a mix of human features and something that simply shouldn't exist. Her eyes were empty, yet they seemed locked on ours. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low and icy, echoing as if it were inside my head. That was all it took for us to run. Chris and I didn't stop until we were out of the cemetery, and we didn't dare look back. After that night, Chris and I promised never to return to the cemetery. But for me, it wasn't over. I couldn't stop seeing her face, or whatever it was, in my mind. I started having recurring nightmares, always the same scene. The woman in black watching me while I was frozen among the tombstones. Chris tried to convince me that we needed to forget everything, that it was better to pretend it never happened. But I knew it wasn't that simple. There was something about her that felt like it was following me, even when I was far from that place. A week later, I found another white flower in the park across from my house. This time, it was right beneath my window. It was impossible to ignore. I called Chris, and he came running over. When I showed him the flower, his face went pale. "She's following us," he said, his voice trembling with fear. We decided we couldn't handle it alone anymore. The next day, we went to the local police station and tried to explain what had been happening, but the response was far from helpful. The officer who took our statement seemed skeptical and suggested it was probably a cruel prank. We couldn't blame anyone for not believing us. Even we doubted what we'd seen. Over time, the woman in black stopped appearing as frequently. The white flowers stopped showing up, and I began to believe it was finally over. But the feeling of being watched never completely left me. To this day, I avoid going near cemeteries, even during the day. Chris changed too. He doesn't talk much about what happened, but I know it left a mark on both of us that will never go away. Sometimes, when we're together, he'll make a joke to lighten the mood, but the glimmer in his eyes never fully returns. What scares me most is not knowing. Who was that woman? Why did she do what she did? And more importantly, why us? I've never found any answers, and maybe it's better that way. Some things aren't meant to be understood. All I know is that even after all these years, whenever I see a white flower, I feel a chill run down my spine. And though time has passed, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in the shadows of some cemetery, she's still out there, repeating her strange, silent ritual. I just hope I never see her again. I've never been a superstitious person. I grew up in a small town surrounded by ghost stories everyone liked to share, but I never took them seriously. Back in 2016, I was 23 years old, unemployed, and renting a house with my best friend Jake. We often went out for late-night walks to chat and clear our heads. Our house was near an old cemetery, the kind with cracked headstones and twisted trees that looked like claws in the dark. It was the type of place that could give anyone chills, but to us, it was just part of the neighborhood. That October night was colder than usual, and a sharp wind was blowing as we decided to take a stroll there. The sky was moonless, making everything seem even more ominous. Jake was especially talkative, going on about a true crime documentary he'd watched. I was trying to focus, but something about that night felt off. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. As we passed the cemetery gates, a strange uneasiness washed over me. It wasn't fear exactly, but a kind of tension I couldn't shake. We walked slowly, using the flashlights on our phones to navigate the uneven ground between headstones. Occasionally, the wind carried the sound of dry leaves skittering across the path, but other than that, it was eerily quiet. Too quiet. After a few minutes, I noticed a faint light ahead. It looked like a flickering candle. Pointing it out to Jake, I asked if he saw it too. He stopped, squinted, and nodded with a hesitant, "Yeah." We decided to move closer, stepping as quietly as we could. As we got nearer, the light became clearer, and we realized it wasn't just one candle, it was several. A small group of people stood gathered around a grave, their silhouettes illuminated by the wavering glow. They were completely silent, frozen as if suspended in time. It was strange but oddly mesmerizing. We stopped within earshot and began to hear whispers. It wasn't a language we recognized. It sounded like a mix of disjointed sounds, almost like they were chanting in some ancient tongue. My heartbeat quickened, and I felt Jake tug at my arm. "We should leave," he whispered, clearly uneasy. I didn't need convincing. We turned and started backing away slowly, doing our best not to make any noise. Whatever was happening, it wasn't meant for us. Once we were far enough, nearly running, I glanced back one last time. The figures were still there, motionless like statues, with the lights flickering around them. When we finally got back home, the atmosphere was heavy. Jake didn't say a word on the way, and I chose to stay silent too. You know that feeling when you think that if you speak, you'll end up admitting something truly frightening happened? That was it. We got inside, locked the doors, and went straight to our rooms without exchanging a single word. That night felt endless. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in bed, replaying every detail of what we saw. It was like my mind was trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. Deep down, I just wanted to forget it ever happened, but something told me it wouldn't be that easy. The next day, I woke up late. Jake was already in the kitchen, looking as tired as I felt. He had his laptop open, reading something. When I asked what it was, he just turned the screen toward me. It was a local news article posted that morning. The headline read, "Man disappears mysteriously last night." The article explained that a local man named David had last been seen leaving work around 9 o'clock the previous night. No clues had been found, and the police were asking for information. My stomach churned. The timeline matched exactly with when we saw that group in the cemetery. I tried to push the thought away, but Jake said what I had been avoiding. What if he was there, with those people? The idea sounded ridiculous, but at the same time, it made sense. We hadn't seen anyone's face in the cemetery, but the number of people gathered there could have easily included someone who disappeared. Jake suggested we should tell the police, but I wasn't sure what to say. "Hi, we saw some weird people at the cemetery last night." It sounded absurd. Besides, what if it was dangerous? For now, we decided not to do anything. The unease lingered. I couldn't stop picturing those shadowy figures standing still, the flickering lights, and the incomprehensible whispers. It was as if something was wrong with the world, and we'd stumbled into it by accident. Later that day, I got a call from my mom. She lived on the other side of town and rarely called without a reason, so I answered, worried. "Have you heard about the disappearance?" she asked, her voice tense. I told her yes, I'd seen the news, and then she shared something that made me even more uneasy. She said that years ago, when she was younger, she'd heard stories about rituals taking place in local cemeteries. According to her, people spoke of secret gatherings where strange symbols were drawn on the ground, and whenever it happened, someone would vanish mysteriously. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. "That's just small-town folklore, Mom," I said, but deep down, it sent a chill down my spine. That night was even worse than the one before. I tried watching something on TV to distract myself, but every sound around me seemed amplified. The trees swaying outside, the occasional creak of the wooden floor. Everything felt suspicious. Jake was restless too. He spent hours on his laptop, researching rituals and local disappearances. Occasionally, he'd mutter, "Wow, look at this," before diving back into typing. I avoided looking at the screen, but eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. He'd found an obscure page on a forum discussing urban cults. One of the stories was eerily similar to what we'd seen. It described groups gathering in cemeteries to perform binding rituals, a process where someone was offered to unknown forces in exchange for favors or protection. It felt like we were reading about the exact thing we witnessed. Even though I tried to ignore it, everything seemed to point back to that group in the cemetery. The more we learned, the more anxious I became, as if something was watching us. Late that night, I heard a strange noise coming from the backyard. It was low and continuous, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My heart raced, but I forced myself to look out the window. There was nothing outside, just the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. I sighed with relief, but as I turned back toward my bed, something caught my attention. On the opposite wall of my room, there was a mark that I was sure hadn't been there before. It looked like a deep scratch, but it twisted in a deliberate, almost purposeful line. I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't sleep after that. The next day, Jake suggested we go back to the cemetery. I thought he was out of his mind, but he insisted we needed answers. After a lot of arguing, I agreed, on the condition that we wouldn't get too close, just observe from a distance. We waited until nightfall and headed there, armed with flashlights and fully charged phones, ready to run at the first sign of danger. When we arrived, everything looked normal. No lights, no shadowy figures among the gravestones, just the cold wind sweeping through the trees. But something was different. One of the headstones, the very one the group had gathered around, was broken in half. On the ground, symbols had been carved into the dirt with eerie precision. I didn't understand their meaning, but they gave me chills. Jake snapped a few photos and urged us to leave before anyone spotted us. As we walked back, he kept staring at the images on his phone, trying to find a pattern in the symbols. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. Then, something stopped us dead in our tracks. It was a sound. Not the wind or leaves rustling. It was a low, drawn-out moan, like someone in agony. I looked at Jake, hoping he'd say he didn't hear it, but his face was pale, his eyes wide. "We need to get out of here," he whispered, and we started running, not daring to look back. When we got home, we locked the door and collapsed on the couch, trying to catch our breath. Jake was visibly shaken but trying to play it off. I, on the other hand, couldn't stop trembling. The sound of that moan kept echoing in my mind. "That wasn't human," Jake said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked at him, confused. The sound. It wasn't human. It didn't sound normal. I nodded, but didn't know how to respond. Something about that night had crossed an invisible line, something that put us far beyond anything safe or understandable. After a few minutes of silence, we decided the best thing to do was turn off the lights and try to forget. The next morning brought even more unsettling news. A new update on David's disappearance revealed that his phone's last known location was inexplicably inside the cemetery. No other clues had been found, but the detail didn't escape Jake or me. We tried to move on with our lives as if nothing had happened, but the feeling that something was watching us never quite went away. Little things started happening at home. The lights flickered without reason, strange noises echoed at night, and that mark on my wall seemed to deepen on its own. I knew we needed to do something, but what? Call the police? Seek out someone more experienced? Nothing felt like a practical solution. After much deliberation, I decided to delete the photos Jake had taken at the cemetery. He thought I was overreacting, but eventually agreed to delete them too. I wanted to believe that cutting any connection to what we saw would make things go back to normal. For a while, it seemed to work. The noises stopped, the lights stayed steady, and the mark on the wall completely vanished. But sometimes, at night, I still feel that same uneasiness, as if something is waiting for the right moment to return. Jake and I never talked about it again and have avoided the cemetery ever since. To this day, I don't know what really happened that night. Was it a coincidence? Or did we stumble upon something we were never meant to see? I can't say for sure. What I do know is that whenever I hear about mysterious disappearances or strange rituals, I get a chill. Maybe it's because deep down, I know those stories have some truth to them. And if I've learned anything, it's that when your gut tells you to leave, you should listen. Sometimes it's better not to seek answers to questions you might not want to know.